Welcome to episode 0 of the Weird Warriors podcast. I'm Max.
I'm Rich.
And on this podcast, we will be focusing on the Weird War Tales series from DC Comics, published for 124 issues from 1971 to 1983. We'll also periodically talk about other horror and or war-themed comics from DC and from other publishers like Marvel and Charlton, etc. As we move along. So if you like war comics, or if you like horror comics, or especially if you like both of those things, this podcast is for you. So without further ado, let's get into episode 0 and introduce ourselves to our readers. Rich, you go first.
Okay, well, one of the first comics I picked up was a 40-cent Sergeant Rock back in 1979, I think it was. Walden Books, remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, for the good old days of brick and mortar bookstores. Was it DC Comics Presents was another one. Superman bursting out of the ground behind Easy Company and Sergeant Rock and everything. That was another one that went back. Joe Staten and everything.
I love DC Presents, yeah.
Yeah. Got Joe to sign my copy of that one on the show.
Uh-huh.
My dad has two younger brothers, had old comic stash in my grandparents' old attic, and I read their old DC war books to tatters. Pick up the Nam, GI Combat, stuff like that. Just the war books always really reached out to me. And you'd think I would have outgrown the comics once I reached a certain age, but no, actually, I blame you for that.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get to that part. We'll pin down exactly when you maybe started to escape, and then I happened along. But as far as me, like when I started with comics, I've told this a million times to people, but I learned to read pretty much from comic books, from my mom reading me comics, and then me reading along with them. So I learned how to read before I hit kindergarten. So I've been reading comics literally pretty much my whole life. So I started probably when I was 4, and I haven't stopped since. And I never had one of those periods where I drifted away or, thought, I'm going to, put my energy into something else. No, God forbid. No, I stuck with comics right up until this very moment. So, as a segue from that into what we were just talking about, like after you got started with comics, what happened next? Like when did you drift out? What was your journey like, and what's it like now?
Well, until I got my driver's license, it was just whatever you would find when going to a bookstore or something. My family used to have this place up on Lake George, New York, and there was this little general store, right on the main road in Silver Bay, and you go in there. And
yeah, I remember that place.
Yeah, and it would have the like a GI Combat on the rack or something like that. And those are the days you just remember so well. Just is finding like these DC war books on the rack, like up at the Adirondacks, and you buy it and you take it back to the lake, and you're sitting on the dock and you're reading, the Adventures of the Haunted Tank and everything else like that. And it was catch as catch can. Until I got a license and everything, because there's comic book stores and you drive past them with your parents, be like, oh yeah, man, one of these days I really need to go in there and check that place out, and you never did. And one fine day, the individual across the mic from me here, he's just like, hey, you like comic books, don't you? It's just like, there's this place in Troy called Apollonia, free plug, and I think you should come on down and see what they've got and see if there's anything that you like. And here I am, like 19 years old, thinking I'm over comic books. I'm like, well, okay. And yeah, if you can see my basic now with all the long boxes and stuff, comic books that I have downstairs now, it's just like, yeah, my wife would probably like, thanks, Max. Thanks.
Yeah. See, I do pretty good work, I must admit. Because oddly enough, you have a much more extensive permanent collection than me, although I'm starting to build one for maybe the first time in my life now that I've got a place that I don't plan on leaving anytime soon.
I'm old school. I know you're doing like the digital thing and stuff like that.
I am.
Just always prefer the paper.
I love going digital because it's just like it just takes up less space. It's faster, and I don't have to go hunting. But we were talking about that catch as catch can feeling, and where I got my comics when I was young. At first, it was stuff my dad would bring home from the mill, like comics they were going to use as packing material, and he'd just slap them down, and he got to be the hero bringing home a bunch of comics he didn't pay for. And those were the ones my mom read to me. And then eventually it was like, go to visit my grandmother, hit the pharmacy. What's that? 2 spinner racks full of comics. Oh my God, and then that's when the hook really got in. I realized whenever I visited my grandmother, I could do some little errands for her and get like $1 for 35-cent comic books,
Mm.
and that was just the start of it. But then it was chasing things around. Like you'd find a newsroom that sold comics, and then you also had the pharmacy, and you had these different points you had to hit and triangulate between and hope if you got hooked on a series, you'd get to see the next issue ever, and then when you did discover a comic shop, that made all the difference, because you could say, I'm going to come back here, and when I do come back here, you will have this book for me. And then that just exponentially exploded, and I became the monster that I am now, and that I was when you met me. And I was like, hey, you like comics, right? Let's go to Aquilonia. And I'm sitting there going, what series can I talk this guy into buying so that I can read them off of him? And that's always been part of my gig, is getting my friends into comics so I don't have to buy every single one of them that's out there. So yeah, I mean, like, as far as a permanent collection, like, I moved around way too much, this, to justify lugging around long boxes everywhere I go. And I do stick with digital now, but some stuff you just can't. Like, I love ROM, Micronauts, and books like that are never going to be reprinted because the rights are just in limbo. So there's some things that even a digital addict like me, like a devotee of digital comics, you've got to go for the physical stuff. And some, maybe Sergio and Mark Evanier will reprint Gru at some point in a good format, but I can't wait. So I've got to have all those physical issues too. So that's where I'm at. And that's us and our history with comics, which brings us up to the comic book series this podcast will focus on, Weird War Tales. So you tell me, how did you first get into Weird War Tales? What is your Weird War draft story?
Well, my the flagship of my collection is the old DC War books. Like, I've got like 6 long boxes, of one title or another. And
yeah, you're the guy. You're the war comics guy in so many shops around the country. Yeah.
Yeah, there's it's funny that you say that. There was this I went to school in Western Pennsylvania, and there was a comic book shop about near Hazleton. I think it was about the halfway point between where I lived and where the school was. I would go to this comic book store once a year, and they would remember me as being the DC War comic guy. But yeah, it is by without a doubt the flagship of my collection. Like, I only am short about 4 dozen books, and I'll have them all, really. Weird War was actually one of the last books I started looking into. I think it was one of those deals I was probably flipping through a 3 for $1 box or something, and I found issue 92 or whatever the hell it was. I'm like,
it's a cheap series, everybody. You can dive right in.
I'm like, oh, what the hell? And as the saying goes, one thing led to another, and before long, I was, they were in they were on the comic book hunt list for issues that I needed to look for before I got the complete run, and I do have them all. And yeah, wasn't something was typically in my wheelhouse. Like I said, it was one of the last books I started collecting. But there's a lot of good stuff in there, and it's actually, like I said, I have no idea what my first one was. It was whatever I found, like a 3 for $1 box or something. It was just a catch.
Yeah, well, I did figure out what my first issue most likely probably was. But what I think is, one of the interesting points of this dynamic between you and me in this series in general, and in comics in general, is I got into Weird War backwards, completely the opposite way that you did. I was into horror comics first. I loved like House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Dr. Graves, like all the Charlton books. Like that pharmacy I mentioned by my grandmother's house actually carried Charlton comics, and they put out these 4 or 5 really great just monster books, and I was an addict for those, like these short stories with little twist endings and things like that. So when I first saw this book, and like I said, paging around the internet, I figured out that my first issue was probably number 68, so it's going to take us a while to get to that one on the show, which was published in like 1978, about 13 days before I would turn 7. So I did encounter the series early, and I stuck with it to the bitter end from there. But I came in because I was like, this isn't just some boring boring old army comic like the ones this guy Rich likes that I haven't met yet. Like I was not into the war books at all. If it was just Sergeant Rock or just some war stories, I was like, so there's no monsters at all? Skip. And so Weird War Tales ironically got me into more military comics. Like once I was reading that book, I decided, well, that maybe I should give Sergeant Rock a chance. Or someone would reprint, there'd be a reprinting of The War That Time Forgot, and
Yeah.
some other book, and I would read that.
I could certainly see us doing a spin-off and stuff like that, because the Star Spangled War stories, they had a bunch of books where some shot down bomber crew or some survivors from a sunk sub or something like this wash ashore on an island that's overrun by dinosaurs, and hilarity ensues.
Yeah, I
And
fully plan on it. That we're gonna cover, especially any of the DC stuff that mixed war with monsters and sci-fi. Not just this series. I mean, but this is a good spine to run through, and it provides a pretty good podcast title too. But yeah, it's just funny. Like I got into it, because I was more into the supernatural angle, and then that ended up convincing me to try, more standard military comics or army comics or war books, whatever the genre title is. By the time I met you, I had actually read a bunch of Sergeant Rocks and a bunch of Sergeant Furies and The Losers, and wherever I could get a hold of reprints. Usually, I think DC did some digests with just the army or the war books too. So I grabbed up those because they were a nice early source of back issues for us kids that can only get to a newsroom. So that's how we both got into to Weird War. That's how we both got into comics in general. But we've mentioned like we ran into each other at some point in life. I want you to tell your version of the story of how we first met, so I'll just let you take it away.
Well, I like to draw, and you like to draw, and we both like to draw. And
I got to do it more often.
yeah, no kidding. I mean, God, I'm good enough a drawer if I don't mind myself saying that I've got stuff up on the walls of my own house that I'm not ashamed of, and most importantly, my wife's not ashamed of.
Dude, you can draw vehicles. That is rare even in the world of professional artists. I cannot draw vehicles. I will avoid that till the end of my days.
Well, I've rule number one is patience. Don't be afraid to start over.
Yeah, patience. How long does that take?
But yeah, so we're going to Hudson Valley Community College, aka Harvard on the Hudson, and we had a art class, and there was one little like hallway where like the extra desks were with windows overlooking the main drag and stuff like that. And I forget who was there first.
You were there first. I remember being very disappointed, but go ahead.
There's the one seat left, farthest away from everybody, and I'm sitting there drawing, and he comes up and he sits down next to me, and we just kind of look at each other like, all right, whatever. And you're kind of looking over my stuff, and I'm kind of looking over at your stuff, and I'm like, similar interests. This might not be too bad. And as the saying goes, that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, which led to skipping classes for a week and going comic hopping to stores across the greater New England area. And
yeah, I mean, when I say I dragged you back into comics and I was the sinister Pied Piper and whatnot, you did your share of making me realize I'd created a monster as well, because I didn't even have a car back then. Like, yes, I was living with my brother and his girlfriend in an apartment in Troy. You were my friend with a car that I was like, I can con this guy into giving me rides to places. And then, man, did we do that? On that walk back from drawing class to the main campus, when I basically interrogated you and figured out that you were a mark, like that set the pattern for we ended up, dear listeners, we ended up taking this road trip where we just didn't go to school for a week. And Rich had mapped out where all these comic shops were using the yellow pages within reasonable driving distance, where we could both pretend we were still going to class and coming home that night or that afternoon. I had to do less faking because my brother didn't care what I was doing, but Rich was going home to his parents. So, we would hit these shops all over
50 miles. We can do that.
New York area. I mean, I don't think we left the state I can't say I was paying attention, but
Max, the first time you ever tried to drive to my house on your own, you called me from the mall and said, Rich, where do you live? I'm like, dude, you've been here how many times?
I have so much comic book information in my brain. I can't possibly pay attention to directions. And you were driving me everywhere. My friends drove me everywhere. And all I did was what? Talk the whole time. Whether my friends were listening or not, you know this. Like you'd be like, "Hey, let me turn up this Pink Floyd tape so we can talk about that instead." God damn it, you know. Like, so I didn't remember how to get to any place. You know, I just magically would appear there, and my friends would let me out of their car. So yeah, I got lost on the way to your place, and you know, I don't know where we were going with that, but I don't know where I'm going in general all the time. Anyway,
I'm pretty sure we got into Massachusetts and Vermont.
Oh, that yes, picking up the thread. See, this is what I can't do. But yeah, I'm saved by the fact that we all have smartphones with maps apps now and stuff, and I can act like I know what I'm doing. But yeah, we went around to all these shops, and there was one place in particular. It was run by a little old lady that I remember thinking in my very scrupulous mind, we could just take whatever we wanted out of this place.
Could have robbed her.
She was squirreled away in the back of the building. There were like 2 whole rooms she couldn't even see. And, you know, the thought crosses your mind, you know, but you don't do it because, hey, you've read enough comic books to know right from wrong, right? But the outstanding feature of this store was what?
It's one of these things, it's a double take. You had to look twice just to make sure that your mind wasn't playing tricks on you. There was like a magazine rack just overflowing with comic books. And the only thing that were keeping the comic books from falling out of the slots and just cascading all over the floor was a strip of underwear elastic. I swear to God, I am not making this up.
I am almost certain I remember seeing like a waistband measurement number on one of these strips.
God.
Like that. And it wasn't even one long strip. Like somehow she had found like what Fruit of the Loom used to cut waistbands. I think some of these were stapled together at lengths.
Wouldn't have doubted it.
And it was just like, okay, even as terrible a person as I was back then, that was the final nail in the coffin of even amusingly entertaining myself that we would just rob this place blind. Because like the poor woman's holding up comics with what looks like hopefully unused underwear elastic.
Hopefully.
So, you know, we were good doobies, and I believe bought a bunch of books off her. I mean, there was a store that was in a guy's garage. Remember, I thought we were going to get like ethered and end up in the basement or something. Like it was literally just his garage. And I think I bought the first Dark Horse Aliens Predator miniseries off of him. He had it bagged.
I think that was before Pulp Fiction came out, so you didn't have to worry about the GIMP or anything.
Yeah, I mean, like things like, but remember, I read a lot of horror comics, and like by then I had read a lot of Creepy and Eerie magazine too from Warren, which were a little darker than the stuff you'd see in House of Mystery. So, you know, not like I've ever trusted anybody, but I was pretty paranoid back then. But, you know, that's why I was like, you going into this garage first. But if I remember, he turned out to be a really nice dude. But I still had one eye on him the whole time. So, yeah, we came back from this. You know, we did this week-long trip, and we're like, haha, we totally got away with it. That was awesome. And, like, we went in the next week, we went into our math class that we had together. And we walk in, and everyone is sitting at their desk cramming. Like they got their books out and everyone's quiet and they're just intensely studying. And we're sitting there going, what the heck's going on here? And as it turns out, we were about to have a test that the teacher had told everyone about the week before when we weren't there. And it was going to be the only grade we would receive before the report cards went home. And I believe I got a 43 on that test. Out of sheer guessing.
I couldn't even begin to guess.
I think you got lower than me. Because I remember thinking that wasn't possible.
I was a history major. I wasn't a math major. There's a reason.
Well, I ended up being an English major when I finally picked a major many years later. So
what did you do with that?
Yeah. What I do with that, I started a podcast.
If I want to talk, I ended up getting a history degree at my 4-year school I ended up going to. What did I do with that? right.
Yeah. Well, you're part of history. You are. And that brings us to something we can actually change the subject here, which will happen rarely.
Segue.
It will happen rarely on this show because I am involved. But as far as what you do with that and you being a history major, you at least, you've always been a big fan of the military, of Army comics, war comics, stuff like that. And eventually you went ahead and jumped in to the fiction. You joined the Army, man. How'd that happen?
Oh, wow. Well, has the Army has this the maximum age of non-prior service enlistment is 35, and from the time I graduated high school, I just kept finding real or imagined excuses not to do it. And I mean, after 9/11 happened, I was all set to go charging in, and my wife was like 8.5 months along with kid one. And yeah, I can't do that. And I aged
Yeah, you
out.
let Frank Miller go for you because he's so brave.
Yeah, and I was like, well, hell, that's that. And then they got the surge and everything else, and the Army pushed the age back to 42. And I was unemployed. I couldn't find anything. My son was old enough to understand. It was like the fates were like, look, if you're ever going to do this, this is like the soccer equivalent of extra time. This is like, if you're going to do it, it's got to be now. So I had the talk and met my wife's preconditions. And I raised the old right hand at 40, and I shipped out to basic training at 41. And yeah, that is literally old enough to be the father of about 3/4 of the kids I was training with, including a good chunk of the drill sergeants. But
oh, that must have been fun.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just, well, hey, I was the father figure. I mean, the great thing about doing basic training at that age was the drill sergeants generally left you alone because, like, yeah, this guy's been around the block a few times. We don't have to worry about this dude. But approaching the halfway point. I'm about to get my 20 in. Approaching the halfway point next month, actually. And nice to get that pension and get that nice veteran headstone when I shuffle off this mortal coil.
Oh, good. Yeah, make sure you don't drop it on your foot. Well, they don't give you that like ahead of time.
Oh,
you have to like keep it in your bedroom.
That would be assuming that you know when you're going to shuffle off.
Yeah, here's a cue for the listeners. I don't know a damn thing about the military. I know what I've read from comic books. Like I know how if the military works like GI Joe, I am an expert. But other than that, I probably have some learning to do.
GI Joe. I mean, the guys that could blow a tank apart from 3 miles out, but can't shoot a guy, sitting as close away from him as Han Solo and Greedo. Yeah, that's some great marksmanship skills there.
Yeah, and they all have code names, and they always fight the same bad guys, and no one ever really gets shot. Well, unless you're reading
that one guy that goes into a coma every week.
Yeah, if you're reading the Larry Hama comics, yeah, lots of people get shot, and the whole village is killed in the first issue, which was like I started with that comic, and then the cartoon came on, and I'm like, these are two different worlds. But we're not doing a GI Joe podcast.
That's been done.
Yeah, there's good ones out there right now that I like. The Long Box Crusade is covering the Devil's Due years as we record this, and I am having a blast listening to that. But you were the old man in basic training.
Oh yeah, one of the stories I love to tell is when I was assigned to my first unit, there was a colonel. I told him my story, and he just shook his head. He's just like, man, I couldn't even imagine doing basic training at your age. That's just wow. That's just unbelievable. The awkward thing is doing it at my age. It's like I said, you're the father figure. And I joined the military at an age where people could retire. People were leaving the military with a pension when I was going in. So there were a lot of weird spaces for me because, here I am, I'm 40 years old. I'm old enough to be like, a lieutenant colonel or a master sergeant or something like that with a lot of authority. And here I am, I'm like, a specialist. I'm supposed to be hanging out with these, 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds. And I didn't really fit in.
Yeah, anywhere. That can't be annoying for all parties.
I had more in common with, the lieutenant colonel and the first sergeant and crap like that, but I only had like half their rank. So the first couple of years were a little on the awkward side, but I think the seniors, we had, it was the whole thing with my age and stuff like that, we had a lot in common. So there would be times I'd be sitting in my my section chief's office, just who I was older than, by the way, just talking about books that we've read and and everything else like that.
So yeah, now you have, despite all expectations to the contrary, been promoted a few times. What have you gotten yourself up to now? You started out as old man privates.
Actually, because
Well, you didn't get the old man privates joke, but that's fine. But
I was trying to let that go. Because I was blessed with a 4-year degree before I raised old Jan right hand. I started off as an E4 specialist, which is as high up the food chain as you can go, just jumping right in. And I have since worked my way up to staff sergeant, E6, which is climbing up the NCO ranks. Everyone's like, why didn't you go officer? It's like, just there's too many jokes about officers. It's the NCOs that do the work for a living and everything else like that. If you ever want to go officer, you have to.
Yeah, you don't want to give them any extra material.
So yeah, I just got promoted this year to staff sergeant. Like I said before, I'd like to ride this out to get my 20. I'm halfway there. It's been quite the ride. Been quite the ride so far. I haven't deployed any sandbox or anything, but I've had more than my fair share of domestic duties and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so,
didn't you organize a dance once?
Okay, well, the backstory.
That's literally the only duty I remember you telling me about, is that it was like an officer's ball, and I was just like, well, go get him, Tiger.
All right, okay, okay. Yes, I got it. You got to make me tell this one. Okay. There was a domestic. When I was the first unit I was assigned to, we were assigned. It was a domestic deployment. Essentially, if we got hit with a weapon of mass destruction stateside, that's what my unit would have responded to. If like LA gets nuked, or Cincinnati gets dirty bombed or something like that.
Sure. Now I feel like a jerk.
That's the way we would have gone to. But I was assigned to a brigade headquarters, and as brigade headquarters, we had a bunch of battalions underneath us, and we had a 1-star that was running the show. And one of the things that got dropped in I'm a being old dude. One of the preconditions was my wife wanted me to get an MOS, a military job, with real world applications. Her whole thing was, don't go into artillery and then bitch you can't find a job to get out. So I'm like, yes, dear. And I found a job in human resources. So whenever there's a ball or a party or something like that, this stuff always gets dropped in the S1 shop slab. So here we are, we're playing the Patriot Ball. Dun, dun, dun. And the commanding general wanted a guest speaker, so he's just, all the other battalion commanders are all, hey, how about we get this politician? And hey, how about we get this retired general? And hey, how about we get this blah, blah, blah. And I'm a historian, and I've got contacts in the National Park Service and stuff like that. My idea was like, well, hey, how about we get, a park ranger from like Lexington Concord, and he can come over here and he could give our spiel and everything else like that. And here you got all these lieutenant colonels. Here this little E4 specialist is, and the general's like, I like his idea. Do that.
There we go. And it was commendations all upwards from there. So see, dear listeners, we will tell stories at least that exciting and thrilling as this podcast goes on. We'll be using, I will be leaning very heavily on the fact that Rich actually has experience in the military and knows what the heck he's talking about, which will be a stark contrast to my contributions. And we will discuss every single issue is the plan of Weird War Tales and a bunch of other books that get in our way and catch our eyes like shiny objects as we go forward. Yeah, exactly. The squirrel that is probably also a vampire, or whatever the Weird War Tales twist is.
Rabbit and Monty Python.
Yes, the Monty Python rabbit. But we'll get into, when we do episode 1, we'll get into a format. We do have a plan. We don't want to get into it here, but we'll have a format by which we dissect each issue, and we'll get in, we'll get out, we'll ramble, we'll rave, we'll tell stories that don't have any connection to anything, but we'll mostly talk about comics, and hopefully people will also chime in and drive the conversation from there. That's the goal, that's the plan, but what they say about plans and contact with the enemy.
And never showing your foxhole to anyone braver than you.
Exactly. So we're gonna wrap it up here, and we're gonna try to say a cute little catchphrase at the same time, and it'll be a disaster. So until next time, everyone, make war
no more.
Or we can say it in sequence like that. That'll work a lot better. And the end.